What are the top 5 differences between Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism? I know this subject very well, being for most of my 20s a Roman Catholic. And this is one of the top questions that comes up all the time, so I thought it would be good to address this in a boil down video. So there may be a little bit of theology and philosophy here, but I'll try to keep it as simple as possible. And my list is not going to be the same as probably a lot of people's lists. It's not to say that everything that they're saying is wrong. It's just to say that from my analysis, there is a different emphasis and a different root as to what led to a lot of the differences between the East and the West. So I'll start with like a number 5 and then boil it down to the number 1. The number 5 difference, I would say, would be in terms of the attitude of morals and sacraments, the morality of the sacraments. So in Roman Catholicism, you have a very laid out and defined doctrine of ex opere operato. And what this means is that the sacraments work by the working of their work. They work on their own by virtue of what Roman Catholics perceive to be a kind of juridical and almost automatic version of how the sacraments work. In Orthodoxy, we don't have a exactly laid out in the sense of Roman Catholicism's medieval scholastic view of the sacraments. There's a lot more room to breathe, you could say. There's no, for example, scientific definition of at what point within the liturgy the Eucharist has been confected or is signified, or what exactly the sort of test tube definition of this or that element of the sacraments is. I mean, certainly we have a sacramentology, but there's just not the legality and juridical dominance that comes to play in the Latin view. And you see that, I think, in the first 7 councils. So we're not Donatist either, and that's an early church mistake that stressed the validity of the sacraments being dependent on the moral power and worth of the minister. So while we don't think the sacraments are dependent on the moral worth of the minister, we also think there is a doctrinal element in play here. And so in that regard, heretics, people that are openly confessing error, they're not necessarily confecting the Eucharist, for example, right? So the Orthodox Church traditionally does not believe that the Eucharist, for example, as a key example, exists outside the visible institutional church. And if you're a Roman Catholic, then you know that there's validity, right? There's valid sacraments for any ordained priest. Even a priest who becomes a Satanist the very day he's ordained, he can still confect the Eucharist. So that's one easy way to see the difference between Orthodox and Roman Catholic views of the sacraments. Obviously, there's a lot more nuance, and a lot of our videos and talks and recommendations can get into that more in depth. But that's one really obvious, clear distinction about the way that the sacraments are viewed. And I would actually put that in my top 5, and that's number 5. Number 4, I would say, would relate to maybe Mary. So the Orthodox Church, of course, has a very high view of Mary. We do believe, with the mindset of the Church of the first millennium, that Mary is the Queen of Heaven, and she is accurately titled, as the Council of Ephesus and St. Cyril taught, Theotokos, the Mother of God. But we also have the Feast of the Dormition, and the Feast of the Dormition recognizes that Mary did fall asleep. She wasn't exempted by necessarily some Immaculate Conception, which was very lately defined by the Roman Catholic Church to be exempted from original sin, right? So we would not necessarily say that Mary had to be immaculately conceived for Christ to remain pure. Now, she was pure. She was the spotless virgin, we would say. She was a perpetual virgin. She was preserved from committing sins in her life. But we do think that the longtime Orthodox liturgy of the Dormition of the Virgin does suggest that she fell asleep. And so she's not raised to a status of, say, co-redemptrix or something like this, or giving new revelations like at Fatima that Roman Catholicism accepts. So we don't have that odd placement and I would argue in many cases superstition that surrounds the Virgin Mary in the Roman Catholic tradition. And really, you see this developing in the second millennium of the Latin West. It's not really present in the first millennium of Christianity. And so Orthodoxy would tend to argue that really we should only make the linchpin, right, of how we view Mary, what is stated in the first millennium, right? The first 8 councils, first 7, 8 councils, if they had it good enough on Mary, we don't need to tack on new ideas. We don't need to dogmatize, new things that weren't necessary in the first 1,000 years of Christianity. And so the Orthodox tradition is consistently holding to what we understood about Mary in the first 1,000 years. And I have done a few little clips and videos on this. And if you want to read a good book on this, I would say read none other than St. Gregory Palamas himself, right? In his Mary, the Mother of God. It's just a little book on his homilies, and you'll get an idea of how we view Mary. And he relies a lot on typology and the biblical text. And so that's why, especially for a Protestant or something like that, I would recommend that book. But also for Roman Catholics, I think you can see that there's a presentation that he gives that is consistent with the first 1,000 years of Christianity. And then to contrast that then with where the Roman tradition evolves into these very odd and bizarre views at times. And almost with Fatima, I think you could argue a new revelation. Right? Fatima almost takes the place of Scripture, public revelation being ceased with the death of the apostles, and now we have these public apparitions that are almost, like I said, new revelations, which is impossible, really. And even though Roman Catholicism may not dogmatically accept those as those apparitions as new revelations, in a lot of practice, they're treated that way. Number 3 on my list would be the issue of the papacy. So perhaps a lot of people would have thought that I would put this as the top issue. In a lot of ways, just maybe from outsider perspective or something like that, it could appear that that's the most obvious difference, right? The Orthodox Church does not believe that the Bishop of Rome possesses a unique charism and power of supremacy, universality, and infallibility and indefectibility. The Orthodox Church believes that any bishopric and any patriarchate, a highly revered, for example, bishopric, which is a patriarchate, which the councils have kind of accorded certain canonical privileges, for example, to bishoprics to make them patriarchates. We don't believe that any of those, by virtue of those privileges or by virtue of necessarily even being an apostolic see, protects them necessarily from the possibility of error or defecting or being in any unique way as an individual bishopric infallible. And so obviously the Vatican I definition of infallibility is unacceptable in Orthodoxy, and we would just simply say the fact that that's defined so late in the game in the 1800s shows that it's obviously not the universal doctrine of the first 1,000 years, right? I mean, wouldn't this have been in the Creed, right? Wouldn't this have been the first thing that was defined in the first ecumenical councils? Wouldn't we have had the clear explication and definition of papal infallibility and indefectibility and supremacy? If that was always universally understood to be the case. In fact, that's what Vatican I says about the papacy, right? It says that it was always universally and easily understood to be the case that the Roman See was universal in its jurisdiction, power, supremacy, and infallibility and indefectibility, right? And that this was conferred directly by Peter. I think that there's a lot of Roman Catholics nowadays that are quite obviously questioning that thesis of Vatican I, given what we've seen, especially in the last few years. So, yes, the papacy does figure prominently there. The Orthodox view, our take on the papacy, you could say, is that in the early church, yes, there was a primacy that Rome possessed. And if you read somebody like St. Irenaeus and his famous Against Heresies, he actually lists why. Right? This is a famously quoted section from Against Heresies by Roman Catholics, where they will talk about the fact that Irenaeus, very early on in the game, 180 or so AD, mentions this primacy. And the interesting thing about this primacy is that it doesn't say anything about Petrine power, or indefectibility in the sense of a perfect charism or a special charism, right? And there's nothing like that. It's said to be a doubly apostolic see, which is because of Peter and Paul. And so, yes, there is an apostolic power and primacy, you could say, that's there because it was Petrine and it was also Pauline. That's Irenaeus' argumentation. But there's no mention in Irenaeus there of anything about infallibility or a special charism, a special gift given to Peter given to his successors by Peter. And just keep in mind, of course, that other sees like Antioch, right, were also established by Peter. So it's a real weird sort of mental gymnastics that goes on where they try to explain how, well, no, Antioch, even though it was established by Peter, has no special charism. Peter, for whatever reason, only passed that special charism to Rome. And then you say, on what basis? We don't know. Oh, because he died there. Really? You see, the argumentation doesn't explain why any bishopric like Antioch, which everyone knows Peter also established the bishopric at Antioch, which is Orthodox, like why Rome would somehow get this special magical charism of infallibility and indefectibility. So they actually shoot themselves in the foot when they argue that the Petrine succession has inerrancy, indefectibility, and infallibility because Peter established Antioch, right? And you can find all the way up into Pope St. Gregory the Great, where even Pope Gregory, very late in the game, is admitting that the Peter see, the Petrine office or see, is at least three, right? It's Rome, Alexandria, and Antioch. Those are all Peter, right? But where in any of this do we get the Vatican I special place for Rome alone? So Orthodoxy sees the canonical privileges and the honor that was given to Rome as doubly apostolic evolving over many centuries to be papal infallibility. And so, yes, there is a place for Rome, just as Peter had a place amongst the apostles, but there's no special place of infallibility and indefectibility on the part of Rome. And in fact, many instances show that Rome has defected, right? At the time of ecumenical councils, where Pope Honorius is condemned, and then later ecumenical councils reaffirmed the condemnation of Honorius, the Sixth Council, and later the Seventh Council. And you get later instances of glaring papal mistakes, especially the difference between Vatican I and Vatican II, very glaring mistakes and contradictions between those councils. And in fact, today's modus operandi of everything that's going on with all the scandals and controversy of Francis also demonstrate that to be the case, that Pope Francis obviously does not possess any special charism of indefectibility from Peter or the Holy Spirit. So I would say that the papacy does rank very high, but the papacy ranks high for different reasons than most people would say, and that's because my number two would be the cosmic scope of Christ's redemption. Now, a lot of people aren't really familiar with this, and they overlook this because they don't think that the cosmic scope is that really important, or what are you talking about? Well, in the Eastern Church Fathers, and even from Irenaeus up into Athanasius and into St. Cyril and into the Cappadocians and up into the 5th and 6th centuries, you get a very clear notion that Christ assumed universal human nature, and that this is the basis for why all men are going to be resurrected. That doesn't mean that all men are saved, right? This is not a statement of universalism. It's a statement about nature being assumed, human nature being assumed by Christ. In his single divine hypostasis, all of human nature is in one sense assumed and contained within his single divine hypostasis and full human nature. So in that sense, that's how these Eastern Fathers all argued. All of humanity will be resurrected, even the wicked. And for the Western tradition from Augustine on, you're going to have problems in their theology explaining how and why the reprobate are resurrected. Why would they be resurrected when they have no connection to Christ? And concomitant with this is the loss of the importance of the descent of Christ into Hades and the harrowing of Hades. And this will eventually lead to differences from the time of, say, Anselm on, and not just Anselm, but Anselm laying the foundations for the Protestant doctrine and understanding of penal substitution. So by the time of Anselm and then by the time of the Reformers, the Latin Church and the Protestant offspring of its mistakes, with further mistakes, is a good example of how Orthodoxy has a completely different understanding. Not totally, I shouldn't say completely, but a vastly different understanding, right? Because we do have a juridical term and there is juridical language that's used, but we don't reduce the doctrine of the atonement to strictly legal and juridical categories. And that's what eventually happens in the West with Protestantism. So in Orthodoxy, you get a different conception of what Christ is doing in the incarnation, in his death and his descent into Hades to preach the gospel to the dead, and then in his resurrection to raise and deify human nature. So the ascension, of course, plays a key role in this as well, and is just as important as the descent into Hades. And we get the destruction of death with all of this. And I can tell you that, yes, there may be areas in which Catholic theologians know about these things and talk about these things, but the importance and the gospel relevance of the descent into Hades, the harrowing of Hades, the destruction of death is completely lost. And they don't know what you're talking about if you talk about the cosmic scope of Christ's incarnation, right? The cosmic scope being recapitulation, that Christ recapitulates everything that Adam lost in his fall. That's completely lost in the West. And I don't even think there's much dispute about that, because there were theologians at the time of Vatican II, Roman Catholic theologians, who wanted to bring some of that back. Why would they want to bring something back if it hadn't been lost? Now, when it comes to the first and foremost big difference, it is the doctrine of the filioque, right? This is the addition to the creed, which occurred over many centuries in the West. It took the West many centuries to really explain in what sense and why they have the addition to the creed. But it's the theological issue that is the main problem. And it's a theological issue because between 1054 and 1274 with the Council of Lyons, it really becomes clear what the Latin Church means by the term. And they make it very clear that they do mean that the Father and the Son together form a hypostatic origin of the Spirit. What that means is just simply to say that for the East, there's a clear way to distinguish the persons in the Trinity. And for us, that's called hypostatic properties. And as we said in the other video on the councils, the Cappadocians, their theology is confirmed at Constantinople I, right? This ecumenical council that follows Nicaea explicitly lays down in what sense we understand the Father to be the cause. And all of those Cappadocians are explicit that it's the Father as the sole cause, right? They're unambiguous on this question. If you read Soshinsky's book on the filioque, the modern academic treatment from a uniate at the time, Soshinsky is very clear that the Cappadocians absolutely believe that the Father alone is the cause of the Son and the Spirit. Therefore, there's no secondary causal role. There's no additional causal role that the Son participates in or shares in with the Father of the Spirit's personal origin. And so once you do have this introduction of the shared causal role, you get an imbalance, right? You get this dyad. And then we will get people like St. Photius the Great calling this out, calling it a dyad, explaining it to be heretical. You'll get St. Gregory Palamas doing an entire treatise, basically restating St. Photius. The treatise is called the Apodictic Treatise on the Holy Spirit. And it shows the logical inconsistencies and heresies of granting to the Son the causal role of the Father, right? So if you do this, you can see how the Roman Catholic Church would then get into confusing who the Spirit is, confusing the Spirit with attributes or energies like love, saying the Spirit is love, or saying that the Spirit proceeds from the will of the Godhead. Now, these kinds of mistakes that ironically were already condemned as Arian mistakes about the Son, right? To say that the Son proceeded by the will of the Father would make the Son a work. right? And that would be to subordinate the Son and to make the Son lesser than the Father and not of the Father's nature. Well, so likewise, in the same way, as the Roman Catholic Church says, right, it says that the Spirit proceeds by will. You cannot say that the Spirit is a product of will, because that would make him a work and make him subordinate. And the only reason that this occurs in the Roman Catholic Church is the original confusion between nature and person. And that confusion between nature and person in Roman Catholic theology, their confusion on the doctrine of simplicity and absolute divine simplicity, is what led to filioque and what led to all of the other mistakes in Christology, including the loss of the cosmic scope of Christ's incarnation, and as well as the many other mistakes all the way into the error of the beatific vision, which Orthodoxy does not accept either. So those are the top 5 differences between Orthodox theology and Roman Catholic theology. My take was a little bit different than many of the other takes that you've seen, but if you like this video, please like and share. And also, there are longer treatments of each of these subjects in my video archive list, which I hope you'll make use of, and I'll try to link some of those below. If you like this analysis, be sure to click subscribe and give me a thumbs up down below. Also, be sure to check out Jay's analysis and definitely click the bell down below to be sure you get the updates.